Welcome to A Slice with Dice, where education meets inspiration and leadership meets real life. I'm Corey Alderdice, Executive Director of the Arkansas School for Mathematics, Sciences, and the Arts. With 2 decades in school leadership, I'll share what I've learned from walking the tightrope between policy and practice, especially when it comes to doing right by gifted students and their futures. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. Last time, we began this special series by reframing dissatisfaction as something more than a nuisance in schools. We talked about the satisfaction gap, the space between what students are experiencing and what they believe they need in order to thrive. Now, that gap, whether small or large, becomes the driver of growth. It fuels the choices that gifted and talented students make, including the sometimes bold decision to leave behind the familiar and pursue specialized opportunities. Today, I want to spend time unpacking what dissatisfaction actually looks like, because it isn't the same for every student. Some students express it in ways that are loud and unmistakable. Others express it quietly, almost invisibly. But underneath those expressions are patterns, 3 distinct intentionalities that help us make sense of what students are really seeking. I call them Eclipse, Evolve, and Escape. Now, I should say this up front. These aren't categories you stamp on a student's forehead. They're lenses, ways of listening more carefully to what students are telling us about their dissatisfaction. And when we get better at recognizing them, we get better at responding in ways that truly meet their needs. All right, so let's start with Eclipse. When a student is in this space, their dissatisfaction comes from ceilings that are too low. They're ready for more than what the curriculum is giving them, and you know what? They know it. You've probably seen this student before. They finish their assignments in half the time it takes their classmates, and then they sit there waiting. They breeze through standardized tests, not because they're gaming the system, but because the questions simply don't stretch them. Sometimes they even start to disengage, not because they don't care about learning, but because the work itself feels irrelevant. Think of the 7th grader who races through math worksheets and then starts doodling dragons in the margins. And to the casual observer, that looks like inattention, but what it really signals is eclipse. A hunger for rigor, for complexity, for the chance to tackle problems that actually feel like problems. Eclipse is aspirational. It's about wanting to climb higher, to go further, and when we ignore it, the danger is cynicism. Students begin to think, why should I bother? None of this matters anyway. But when we meet Eclipse with acceleration and enrichment, that same dissatisfaction becomes the engine of excellence. Now, the second intentionality is evolve. Now, this is a little different. For these students, the dissatisfaction isn't about ceilings, it's actually about belonging. They want to grow not just academically, but personally. They're asking questions like, do I fit here? Does anyone notice me? Who am I becoming in this place? Picture the high school sophomore who gets good grades but never speaks up in class. Teachers describe her as quiet but reliable. Yet outside of school, she pours her energy into theater or robotics or writing. Her dissatisfaction is less about the difficulty of the material and more about whether she is recognized, affirmed, and allowed to grow into her identity. Now, evolve is about personal development as much as academic challenge. It shows up when students seek mentors who look like them, or when they thrive in clubs and activities that affirm who they are. It shows up when students light up in spaces where they feel safe to experiment with identity, but shut down in classrooms where they feel invisible. Now, the risk of overlooking evolve is that these students can drift into isolation. They may do fine on paper, but inside they feel disconnected. When schools respond with authentic affirmation, with mentoring, recognition, and real opportunities for growth, evolved dissatisfaction becomes confidence, resilience, and creativity. The third intentionality is escape. This is the one that often feels the most urgent. Escape students are dissatisfied not because the ceiling is too low or because belonging is missing, but because the entire environment feels misaligned. In short, they want out. Now, sometimes this is academic. They feel trapped in a school that doesn't offer the courses they need. Sometimes it's social. They feel excluded, bullied, or simply invisible. Sometimes it's situational. Family pressures or community contexts make the current school feel like an impossible place to grow. And so these students may voice their dissatisfaction directly. I hate it here. I want to transfer. This place is holding me back. But other times, escape shows up more quietly. Frequent absences, unexplained illnesses, grades that slide not because of ability, but because motivation has drained away. Escape should not be dismissed as avoidance. It's a rational response to a context that feels harmful or suffocating. And the task for educators isn't to talk students out of it. The task is to create new contexts, programs, cohorts, environments that give them a fresh start. When we meet escape with thoughtful separation, these students can re-engage, often with remarkable energy. So, Eclipse, evolve, escape, 3 distinct voices of dissatisfaction. Each one says something slightly different. Eclipse says, I want more. Evolve says, I want to become. Escape says, I need out. And here's the thing. Most students don't live entirely in one of these spaces. They blend. The student who wants more rigor may also want affirmation. The student who longs for belonging may also want a new environment. And the student who feels trapped may also crave harder challenging. And that blending is where things get really interesting. Because when you start to see how Eclipse, evolve, and escape combine, you start to recognize the paradigms of student experience that shape how dissatisfaction fuels growth. And we'll dig into those paradigms in the next episode. All right, so you might be wondering, why does it matter to draw these distinctions? Isn't dissatisfaction just dissatisfaction? Here's why it matters. When we fail to understand the type of dissatisfaction, we risk giving the wrong response. If a student is in Eclipse and we only offer them affirmation without rigor, they'll feel patronized. If a student is in Evolve and we only offer harder courses without belonging, they'll feel brittle and unsupported. And if a student is in Escape and we insist they stay put, they'll shut down entirely. But when we get the intentionality right, when we listen carefully and interpret what dissatisfaction is really about, we can respond with precision. We can match students with the opportunities they're seeking, and in doing so, we don't just close satisfaction gaps, we open pathways for agency. As educators of gifted and talented students, we often pride ourselves on seeing potential. But seeing potential is only part of the story. We also have to hear dissatisfaction. Because dissatisfaction is the student's own voice telling us where the potential is ready to grow. Eclipse tells us they're ready for more. Evolves tells us they're ready to become. Escape tells us they're ready for something new. When we learn to listen to those voices, we move from guessing at what students need to truly responding to what they're asking for. So next time, we'll explore how these intentionalities blend together into distinct paradigms. Transitional, transformational, typical, and at the center, catalytic agency. Each paradigm carries its own story, its own risk, and its own opportunities. But for now, I hope you'll walk away from this episode with a different ear for the voices of dissatisfaction in your classrooms. They're not signs of failure. They're very real signs of readiness. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next week, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.